A well-built submarine can stay in service for decades. They're vessels that work in dangerous conditions, but so long as they stay out of trouble, they're sturdy and dependable. When their working life is over, most of them are either scrapped or recycled. Not all of them finish up that way, though. Some become museums. Others become abandoned altogether. Their stories are fascinating, and we've got a great collection of them to tell you about now. The INS Kursura S-20 is both a submarine and a source of national pride in India. When she was launched in February 1969, she was only the fourth submarine India had ever built. The vessel is a Kalvari-class submarine, which is a variant of the Soviet Union's Foxtrot class. The Kursura served in the Indian Navy for over 30 years, most notably during the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971, where she's said to have played a crucial role in patrol missions. After the war, she was mostly used for friendly naval exercises with other nations and was sent to visit other countries as a goodwill vessel. The Kursura was finally retired in February 2001, at which point Indian Chief Minister N. Chandrababu Naidu dedicated the vessel to the nation and announced she would be preserved as a museum. The first members of the general public to be allowed to visit the Kursura climbed aboard in August 2002. She's the only vessel in the Indian Navy's entire fleet to retain dressing ship status after retirement, which is a sign of how much she means to the Navy and also the people of India. Our next submarine actually started life with the Soviet Union, but she's a long way from home now. She was built in Shipyard 112 in Gorky, Russia, in April 1955 and launched in September of that year, serving in the Soviet Union's Navy for a little over 7 years before being sold to Indonesia. When the sale happened, she got a whole new identity. The vessel was originally known simply as S-290, but in the hands of the Indonesian Navy, the Whiskey-class submarine became the KRI Pasopati. She was one of 12 former Soviet submarines acquired by Indonesia in 1962, all of which were patterned after the Type 21 U-boat. Indonesia needed the submarines for an ongoing attempt to seize the Dutch overseas territory of Netherlands, New Guinea, and it was in that attempt during Operation Trikora in 1962 that the KRI Pasopati was badly damaged almost as soon as it arrived. After extensive repairs, she returned to service and remained active until retiring in 1994. Rather than being scrapped, the veteran submarine was taken apart and then reassembled close to Plaza Surabaya, where she's now a museum ship. The INS Gal didn't get off to the most auspicious of starts to her military career. She was built for the Israeli Navy, but her life actually began in Barrow, England, which is where she and the rest of the submarines in her class were built. Technically known as a Type 540 Gal-class submarine, she was the first of her class. Only 2 more were built, the INS Tonijn and the INS Rahav. All 3 vessels were built and launched between 1976 and 1977, but the INS Gal was damaged by accidental grounding during her delivery voyage. She overcame that mishap after extensive repairs and went on to serve with the Israeli Navy for almost 25 years before being decommissioned in the year 2000. The writing had been on the wall for the INS Gal for a while by that point because they'd been withdrawn from active service in favor of new Dolphin-class submarines. It was initially hoped that the Gal could be sold to a private buyer in Germany, but the deal fell through, and so she ended up being shipped back to Haifa. She was eventually adapted to become a museum ship in 2007 and remains open to the public today. At the end of the 1960s, the Soviet Union developed new Vetter and Vodopad anti-submarine systems. In order to test these new systems, the Soviet Union's Navy re-equipped submarines S-49 and S-11 as part of an initiative called Project 633RV. S-49 arrived in Sevastopol in September 1970 for refitting. That process took 2 years, after which the S-49 was sent to Feodosia, where, in December of that year, the first Vodopad torpedo rocket was launched from the vessel at a depth of 150 feet. A further 24 successful test missile launches were recorded over the following 2 years, with the missiles fired from a deeper point each time. Eventually, it proved possible to fire the missiles from a depth of almost 500 feet. That still wasn't enough, though. A new missile firing system was fitted to the experimental submarine in 1975, allowing it to launch from a depth of almost 800 feet. At the time, that was a world record. The S-49 remained in service as a missile testing vessel until the fall of the Soviet Union. Even then, it was kept on for a few years by the Russian Navy before eventually being discharged from the Navy in 1995. It was adapted one more time to become a floating charging station and is still afloat today. We're back to the submarines of the Israeli Navy, and we're specifically looking at the INS Dakar. This diesel-electric submarine was already old by the time the Israelis acquired it. She began life as the HMS Tonijn, laid down in HM Dockyard, Devonport in 1942 and in service with the British Royal Navy for more than 20 years before she was sold to Israel in 1965. The Israelis performed extensive modifications to the old British T-class submarine, the nature of which have never been fully disclosed. Some experts have speculated that the modifications might have been what caused her fate. In January 1968, the INS Dakar was lost with all hands somewhere between Cyprus and Crete. The wreckage of the vessel wasn't found until 1999, when it was located at a depth of almost 10,000 feet. A salvage operation managed to retrieve the INS Dakar's conning tower, which is now on display outside the clandestine Immigration and Naval Museum in Haifa. No official cause for the Dakar's sinking has ever been disclosed, but it seems no emergency measures were taken aboard the vessel before it went down. There are more submarines that have been turned into museums than most people probably imagine there to be. However, only one boat has ever been turned into a floating museum by Italy. It's the S-518 Nazario Saro, the first and only Italian floating museum, and the only Italian submarine that can be visited at sea by the general public. She's the star of the show at the Galata Museo del Mar, where she's been positioned since 2009. The submarine was built for the Italian Navy by Fincantieri in 1976, and led a fairly nondescript military life until 2002. Which was the year of her decommissioning. While almost every submarine museum allows the public to climb inside and take a look around the cramped conditions within the boats, the S-518 Nazario Saro goes a little further. The voices of the crew have been recorded to give the impression that they're still aboard the vessel and still on duty, and the vessel's engines, radar, and sonar are all still operational. You can even experience a simulated torpedo launch while you're aboard, complete with genuine sound recordings of real launches. The Andrea Provana is an altogether different kind of Italian museum exhibit. We know that we just said the Nazario Saro is the only floating Italian museum, but we stand by that point because the Andrea Provana isn't floating. Instead, she's embedded in a thick layer of concrete close to Ponte Isabella in Turin. Technically speaking, the Andrea Provana is a First World War submarine. We say technically speaking because she never actually took part in the war. She was built at the Fiat shipyard in La Spezia by Cesare Laurenti in 1915. But by the time she was finished, the war was only a few weeks away from coming to an end. She was still put into service, but not as a vessel of war. Instead, her job was to serve as a training vessel for students at the Livorno Naval Academy. She was still performing those duties in 1927 when her right-hand thermal motor exploded without warning. No lives were lost in the incident, but several people were injured, and given the fact that she was considered virtually obsolete, it was decided that she wouldn't be repaired. She was put on permanent public display 12 months later as part of the World Exhibition of 1928. Here's a museum ship in Japan, albeit not one that visitors can climb inside. It's the JDS Akishio, known more formally as the SS-579. The Akishio is a diesel-electric Ushio-class submarine. laid down in 1983 and launched 2 years later. She served with both the 1st and 5th submarine squadrons of the 1st Submarine Flotilla within the Japanese Navy for almost 20 years before being decommissioned in March 2004. The Akishio was never involved in any notable military conflicts during her service life, but she did take part in the Pacific Reach 2000 drills in October 2000, joining vessels from Singapore, South Korea, and the United States of America. This marked the first time that Japanese ships had taken part in multinational submarine rescue drills, and was an important moment from a diplomatic perspective. After decommissioning, the Akishio was pulled out of the water and placed on display outside the Kure Maritime Museum in Hiroshima. Her appearance outside the museum is still considered controversial, as the Japanese national newspaper Asahi Shimbun ran an editorial criticizing the museum for placing too much emphasis on weaponry and military ships, rather than focusing on Japanese maritime achievements. Now we get to see a French take on the idea of a submarine museum. It comes in the shape of the French submarine Ouessant, which is properly known as the S-623. This is an Augusta-class submarine, built for the French Navy at Arsenal de Cherbourg and launched in 1978. France has been fortunate enough to be at peace for many decades, so the Ouessant never saw any significant military action. Instead, she spent almost her entire service life on routine patrols before being decommissioned in 2001. There's some debate about what happened next. What we know for sure is that she became a training vessel in the Royal Malaysian Navy between 2005 and 2009. The Ouessant was only on loan to Malaysia at first, but Malaysia claimed to have permanently acquired the submarine in 2009. France claimed no such deal had been struck, and so the Ouessant was ordered to return to France. We might never know who was wrong or who was right, but the Ouessant was formally handed over to Malaysia in September 2011. She was obsolete by that point, but she became a submarine museum in Klabang, Malacca. Next up, we have the HNLMS Tonijn, also known as the S-805. The Netherlands has never built or sailed many submarines, so that alone makes the Tonijn special. It was laid down in October 1962 at Wilton Feyenoord in Schiedam and launched in June 1965, serving for more than a quarter of a century before being brought home for decommissioning in January 1991. The Tonijn is technically a Potvis-class submarine, but purists would tell you that the Potvis class doesn't really exist. Submarines of the Potvis class are really just modified Dolphin-class vessels. She was lucky to survive an incident in September 1979, which saw fires break out in both the port engine room and starboard engine room simultaneously, and would have been lost had the USS Harlan County not been in the area. The American tank landing ship managed to tow the stricken Tonijn to Gibraltar, where she underwent extensive repairs. A later investigation revealed that the Tonijn had also been suffering from severe battery depletion at the time of the fires, and was down to approximately 10% battery power. Having survived that scare, she's now a museum boat at the Dutch Navy Museum in Den Helder. The PNS Hangor S-131 is one of the most celebrated vessels in the history of the Pakistan Navy. Over her long career, she more than earned her nickname the Shark. The Daphne-class submarine served her country for more than 35 years, launching in 1968 and reporting for decommissioning in 2006. Despite being a national icon in Pakistan, the PNS Hangor didn't start her life there. She was designed and built in France because Pakistan didn't have the capacity to build a submarine of this specification in the 1960s. 3 years after entering active service, she earned a dubious place in history. By order of Commander Ahmed Tasneem, the PNS Hangor fired a homing torpedo at India's INS Kursura on 9 December 1971. The impact was enough to sink the Indian vessel. This was the first recorded submarine kill anywhere in the world since the end of the Second World War. India's Western Fleet launched an immediate search and destroy mission for the Hangor after the incident, but the Hangor survived by remaining submerged for more than a week. This is seen as a heroic tale in Pakistan, which celebrates the incident during Hangor Day every December 9th. The boat is now on display as a museum ship at the Pakistan Maritime Museum. We haven't been to South America yet, so here's the Abtao Submarine Museum in Lima, Peru. It's another retired submarine, and when it opened its doors to the public for the first time, it became the first floating museum in South America. To give this boat her full name, she's the BAP Abtao SS-42, and by the time she retired from active service in 1998, she'd been with the Peruvian Navy for 48 years. Most of the inner workings of the Abtao were left in situ when the vessel was decommissioned, so tourists are invited to push, pull, and prod at whatever levers and dials they wish when they climb aboard. Be warned, though, this submarine is significantly smaller than the HMS Alliance. While that ship was built to provide comfort for British sailors on long trips to the Far East, the Abtao was built for practicality. It's narrow, it's cramped, and it's surprisingly dark in places, even with the lights on. Your visit won't necessarily be comfortable, but it will give you an appreciation for the brave people who served aboard her beneath the waves for weeks at a time. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!